We live inside of it. We absolutely depend on it. But have you ever stopped to ask, what is civilization really? I mean, where did it even come from? And maybe the most important question of all, what does it take to keep it from completely falling apart? Well, today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to break down one of humanity's biggest and maybe most fragile creations. Yeah, it's a word we use all the time, right? Civilization. But if you really stop and think about it, if you peel back all those layers, what's actually in there? What are the essential parts? That's the big question we're diving into.
Okay, so our source material gives us a beautifully simple place to start. Civilization is a social order promoting cultural creation. Just let that sink in for a second. It's what happens when we can finally stop focusing only on survival. It kicks in, as you can see here, at the exact moment that chaos and insecurity stop. It's only when that constant fear is gone that we can unleash our curiosity and creativity.
All right, so where do you even begin with a topic this huge? Well, you start at the very, very beginning. I mean, with the literal ground beneath our feet. So let's get into section 1, the foundation. We're going to go from geology all the way to agriculture. Before we humans can build anything, nature has to set the stage. And what's wild is how fragile that stage really is. I mean, geologically speaking, our entire history is just this tiny, brief, warm spell tucked between massive ice ages. And then geographically, you need the absolute perfect conditions, not too hot, not crawling with parasites, and you gotta have fertile soil and water. Without that natural bedrock in place, civilization, it just doesn't even get off the ground. Okay, this right here is one of the most profound shifts in human psychology ever. On one side, you've got the hunter. He's living completely for the moment, always bouncing between feast or famine. But then you have the farmer, and the farmer enters what our source calls the veil of anxiety. Wow. For the very first time, people have to think about tomorrow. They have to plan for the future, create their own security. This is the game changer. This is the moment we start having both the time and, more importantly, the reason to become civilized. So you can really boil down this whole massive journey into 3 giant steps. First, speech, then agriculture, and finally, writing. And just look at that. Agriculture is sitting right there in the middle. It is the absolute pivot point, the discovery that lets a settled, complex society finally take root. And to really truly appreciate what agriculture gave us, you have to understand what came before. The food supply was so unbelievably uncertain that early humans were, and I'm quoting here, almost literally omnivorous. And yeah, that means exactly what you think it means. Spiders, earthworms, lice, snakes, pretty much anything that could be found. It's just a brutal reminder of how incredibly precarious life was back then. And that level of desperation, well, it led to things that are almost unthinkable for us today. I'm talking about cannibalism, which for a while was practically universal. And that brings us to this truly unforgettable quote. It's shocking, for sure, but what it does is it just throws you into a completely different moral universe, one where the line between eating an animal and eating an enemy, well, it just wasn't drawn in the same place at all. Okay, so with a stable food supply finally starting to become a reality, humanity could at last start to build things. And that brings us right into section 2, the engine of industry. And the source is crystal clear on this point. The first spark of all industry, the true catalyst for everything that followed, was fire. Think about it. It conquered darkness, it gave us warmth, and it was the absolute key to working with metals. It was so miraculous to early humans that, yeah, it was often worshipped as a god. And I love this because it perfectly shows how invention is really a step-by-step process. The wheel didn't just pop into existence one day. No way. It evolved logically. You go from just dragging branches on the ground to putting logs underneath as rollers. Then you get the idea to slice the ends off those logs to make wheels. And boom, you put those under the sledge and you've got a cart. It's just this beautiful, logical cascade of innovation. So once you have better farming and better tools, you start getting surpluses. You have extra stuff. So what do you do with it all? Well, you trade it. It's a totally natural progression. Different villages get good at making different things, which leads to a surplus of those things, which leads to exchange. And that exchange starts out as just giving gifts, then it becomes organized barter, and eventually you get markets and bazaars. But wait, how do you trade if you don't have money? Well, for a long, long time, the standard of value was cattle. And this is a super cool detail. The Latin word for cattle, pecus, is where we get the word for money, pecunia. Even our modern words capital and chattel trace back to the Latin word for head, as in a head of cattle. It's amazing, right? History is just hiding there in plain sight, right in our language. All right, so we've got food starting to get figured out and industry is taking shape. The next huge challenge wasn't about things anymore, it was about people. How do you organize them all? And that leads us straight into Section 3, Organizing Society. This quote is it's so powerful because it throws a window open onto a completely different social reality. The Samoan man, he can't even wrap his head around the idea of homelessness. It just doesn't compute. Why? Because his whole world is based on what our source calls primitive communalism. Land, food, it was all shared. The idea that one person could be left with absolutely nothing, it was literally unthinkable. So what was the turning point? What changed everything? Yep, agriculture. Again. The moment people settled down and started working the same piece of land year after year, it just started to make sense that the family doing the work should own the land. And that's the pivot point where communal, tribal ownership slowly begins to fade, and family, and later, individual property takes over. It was an absolutely monumental shift for humanity. Okay, now this next idea from our source, it's a really challenging one, so stick with me. It suggests that slavery, as absolutely horrific as it was, actually represented a kind of moral improvement over what came before it, which was just killing and eating your captives. The brutal economic logic was simple. A live prisoner is more valuable because they can work. This was the really dark underbelly of organizing labor. But all this stuff, food, tools, property, that's kind of like the hardware of civilization. To actually make it all run, you need the social software. And that brings us to our next part, Section 4, the mind of civilization. Think of these as the invisible pillars that hold the whole thing up. You've got to have political order, right? So you're not in constant fear. You need a unified language so you can actually exchange complex ideas. You need a shared moral code, the basic rules of the game, even if people break them. You need some kind of unifying belief to lift life up beyond just calculation. And last but not least, you need education, the actual technique for passing all of this down to the next generation. And all of this, it leads us to our final section, and it's a crucial one. It's a reminder of just how incredibly delicate this whole project really is. Section 5, a fragile creation. So how do civilizations fall apart? Well, sure, they can be taken out by forces of nature, a sudden climate shift, a terrible plague, but just as often, maybe even more often, the rot comes from within. Just look at this list of internal threats: exhausting the land, running out of resources, a pathological concentration of wealth, and the decay of leadership. I mean, these aren't just abstract theories. These are the exact reasons that great empires have crumbled throughout history. And that leaves us with what might be the most crucial takeaway of all. Civilization isn't some destination we've finally reached. It is not permanent. As this final quote reminds us so powerfully, it's a fragile inheritance. It's something that has to be learned, it has to be protected, and it has to be passed on over and over and over again by every single one of us in every single generation.